Stephen King presents It, a novel by Stephen King. Written by Stephen King. Praise for It, this indestructible king of horror by time. A measuring odyssey of terror, King writes like one possessed never cheats. The reader always gives full measure. He is brilliant, dark, and sinister. The Washington Post Book World. Vintage King, a magnum opus of terror. Just a glance at first few pages, and you can't put this novel aside. St. Louis Post-Dispatch. A great, scary book. A nightmare roller coaster, packed with more chills than a frig dire. It turns out to be the monster dread in us all, the one that refuses to go away. By the San Francisco Chronicles. Epic Garriton, breathlessly, Alariton, suspense. King is our great storyteller. I imagine him as a possessed figure, rocket over a smoke, word processor, hunting for a beat his sentence can dance to, pawning the shocks and beat his sentence can dance to, pawning the shocks and scares like a rock against laying down the power chords. By Los Angeles Herald Examiner. A girl's delight, a good old-fashioned chill and shiverfest, as creepy as the finest of that genre. The Kansas City Star. King's Abulous Project reads as if written in a white heat by San Jones Mercury News. It examines the potato chip syndrome. Quite simple. You can't read just one page and stop. This novel that King comes out of the closet jammed a crowd with his own monsters. By Houston Chronicles. Capitally readable. By Fourth Ward Star Telegram. King's most nature work. By State Petersburg's Times. Choke full of spooky stuff. A sprawling scare. Fest that defies King's reoccurring themes and adds a new set of ambition to the mix. By the Philadelphia Inquirer. It, a novel by Stephen King. Known as #1's best New York seller. This book is gratefully dedicated to my children. My mother and my wife taught me how to be a man. My children taught me how to be free. Nominally, Rachel King at 14 of 1986. Joseph Hillstorm King at 12 in 1986. Owen Philip King at 7 in 1986. Kids' fiction is the truth inside the lie, and the truth of this fiction is simple enough the magic exists. A message by Stephen King. This old town been home along as I remember. This town gonna be here long after I'm gone. East side, west side, take a close look. Round her, you've been down, but you're still in my bones. By the Michael Stanley Band. Old friend, what are you looking for? After those many years aboard you come with images you tended under fortune skies, far away from your own land. By George Severus. Out of the Blue and Into the Black. By Neil Young. Part 1. The Shadow Before. They begin. The perfections are sharpened, the flowers spread, its colored petals wide in the sun, but the tongue of the bee misses them. They sink back into the loam, crying out. You may call it a cry that creeps over them a shiver as they wilt and disappear. By William Carlos Williams Patterson. Borne down in a dead man's town. Bruce Springton. Chapter 1. After the Flood. Year 1957. 1. The terror, which would not end for another 28 years, if it ever did end, began so far as I know or can tell with a boat made from a sheet of newspaper floating down a gutter swallow with rain. The boat bobbed, listened, written itself again, dived bravely though treacherous whirlpools, and continued on its way down Witcham Street toward the traffic light, which marked the intersection of Witcham and Jackson. The three vertical lenses on all sides of the traffic lights were dark his afternoon in the fall of 1957, and the houses were all dark too. There had been steady rain for a week now, and 2 days ago. The winds had come as well. Most sections of Derry had lost their power then, and it was not backed on yet. A small boy in a yellow slicker and red galoshes ran cheerfully along beside the newspaper boat. The rain had not stopped, but it was finally slackening. It taped on the yellow hood on the boy's slicker, sounding to his ears like rain on a shed roof, a comfortable, almost cozy sound. The boy in the yellow slicker was named George Denbrog. He was 6. His brother William, known to most of the kids at Derry Elementary School, and even to the teachers who would never have used the nickname to his face, as Stuttering Bill, was at home, hacking out the last of a nasty case of influenza. In that autumn of 1957, 8 months before the real horrors began, and 28 years before the final showdown, Stuttering Bill was 10 years old. Bill had made the boat beside which George now ran. He had made it sitting up in bed, his back propped against a pile of pillows, while their mother played Furl Elson on the piano in the parlor, and rain swept restlessly against his bedroom window 3/4 of the way down the block as one headed toward the intersection and dead traffic light. Witchcombe Street was blocked to motor traffic by smudged pots, and 4 orange sawhorses celadon across each of the horses was Derry Dep of Public Works. Beyond them, the rain had spilled out of gutters and clogged with branches and rocks and big sticky piles of autumn leaves. The water had first pried fingerholds in the paving and then snatched whole greedy handfuls. All of this by the 3rd day of the rains. By noon of the 4th day, big chunks of the street surface were boating through the intersection of Jackson and Wishcons like miniature white water rafts. By the time many people in Derry had begun to make nervous jokes about ARCS, the Public Works Department had managed to keep Jackson Street open, but Wishcomb's was impossible from the sawhorses all the way to the center of town. But everyone agreed the worst was over. The Kensdick stream was centered just below its bank in the Barhams, and bare inches below the concerned sides of the canal, which cannoned in tightly as it passed through downtown. Right now, a gang of men, Zach Dumbrog, George's and Bill's father, among them, were removing the sandbags they had thrown up the day before with such panic and haste. Yesterday, overflow and expensive food damage had seemed almost inevitable. God knew it had happened before the flooding in 1931 had been a disaster which had cost millions of dollars and almost 24 lives. That was a long time ago, but there were still enough people around who remembered it to scare the rest. One of the flood victims had been found 25 miles east. in Bucksport, the fish had eaten this unfortunate gentleman's eyes. Free of his fingers, his penis, and most of his left foot, clutched at what remained of his hand, had been of forced steering. Now, though the river was receding, when the new Bangor Hydro Dam went in upstreams, the river would cease to be a threat, or so said Zach Denbrog, who worked for Bagran Hydraulic. As for the rest, well, future floods could take care of themselves. The thing was to get through this one, to get the power back on, and then to forget it. In Derry, such forgetting of tragedy and disaster was almost an art. As Bill Debrooke would come to discover in course of time, George paused just beyond the sawhorses at the edge of a deep ravine that had been cut through the tar surface of Witcham Street. This ravine ran on almost exact diagonal. It ended on the far side of the street, roughly 40 feet farther down the hill from where he now stood on the right. He laughed aloud, the sound of solitary, childish glee. A bright runner in that gray afternoon. As a virtuous of the flowing water took his paper boat into a scale model rapids, which had been formed by the break in the tar. The urgent water had cut a channel which ran along the diagonal, and so his boat traveled from one side of Witcham Street to another, the current carrying it so fast that George had to sprint to keep up with it. Water sprayed out from beneath his galoshes in muddy sheets. Their buckles made a jolly jingling as George Debrooke ran toward his strange death. Had the feeling which filled him at that moment was clear and simple love for his brother Bill, love and a touch of regret that Bill couldn't be here to see this and be part of it. Of course, he would try to describe it to Bill when he got home, but he knew he wouldn't be able to make Bill see it the way Bill would have been able to make him see it if their positions had been reversed. Bill was good at reading and writing, but even at his age, George was wise enough to know that wasn't the only reason why Bill got all A's on his report cards, or why his teacher liked his comprehension so well. Telling was only part of it. Bill was good at seeing. The boat nearly whistled along the Diagon Channel, just a page torn from the classic section of the Derry News. But now George imagined it as a PT boat in a war movie, like the ones he sometimes saw down at the Derry Theatre with Bill at Saturday Matins. A war picture with John Wayne fighting the Japs. The pro of the newspaper boat threw sprays of water to either side as it rushed along, and then reached the gutter on the left side of Witcham Street, and fresh streamlet rushed over the break in the tar at this point, creating a fairly whirlpool, and it seemed to him that the boat must have been swamped and capsized. It leaned armly, and then George cheered as it righted itself, turned and went racing on down toward the intersection. George sprinted to catch over his head. A grim gust of October wind rattled the trees, now almost completely unburdened of their fright of color leaves by the storm, which had been this year a reaper of the most ruthless sort. 2. Sitting up in bed, his cheeks still flushed with heat, but his fever, like Kensdebeck, finally rescinded. Bill had finished the boat, but when George reached for it, Bill had held it out of reach. Now, get me the paraffin. What's that? Where is it? It's on the cellar shelf as you go downstairs," Bill said. "In a box that says golf. Bring that to me and a knife and the bowl and a pack of matches." George had gone up repeatedly to get these things. He could hear this mutter playing the piano, not for Ellison now, but something else he didn't like so well, something that sounded dry and fussy. He could hear rain flickering steadily against the kitchen windows. These were comfortable sounds, but the thought of the cellar was not a bit comfortable. He did not like the cellar, and he did not like going down the cellar stairs, because he always imagined there was something down there in the dark. That was silly, of course. His father said so, and his mother said so, and, even more important, Bill said so. But still, he did not like even opening the door to flick on the light, because he always had the idea this was so equally stupid. He didn't dare tell anyone that while he was feeling for the light switch, some horrible clawed paw would settle lightly over his wrist, and then jerk him down into the darkness that smelled of dirt and wet and damn rotted vegetables. Stupid! There were no things with claws, all hairy and full of killing spite. Every now and then, someone went crazy and killed a lot of people sometimes. Chet Hudley told about such things on the evening news. And of course, there were commies, but there was no weirdo monster living down in their cellar. Still, this idea lingered in those interminable moments while he was goppering for the switch with his right hand. His left arm curled around the door jamb in the death grip. That cellar smell seemed to vivify until it filled the world. Smells of dirt and wet and long gone. Vegetables would merge into one unminkable, indestructible smell, the smell of the monster, the appetizing of all monsters. It was the smell of something for which he had no name, the smell of it, crouching, lurking, and ready to spring. A creature which would eat anything, but which was especially hungry for boy meat. He had opened the door that morning and had groped interminably for the switch holding the jamb, his usually death grip. His eyes squinched shut, the tip of his tongue poked from the corner of his mouth like an apis rootlet, searching for the water in the place of drought. Funny. Sure. You betcha. Look at Georgie. Georgie's scared of the dark. What a baby. The sound of the piano came from what his father called the living room, and what his mother called the parlor. It sounded like music from another world, far away, the way talk and laughter from a summer crowd beach must sound to an exhausted swimmer who struck a glass with the undertow. His fingers found the switch. Ah! They snapped it, and nothing, no light. No, oh, cripes, the power! George snatched his arm back as if from a basket filled with snakes. He stepped back from the open cellar door, his heart hurrying in his chest. The power was out. Of course, he had forgotten the power was out. Cheesley Crow! What now? Go back and tell Bill he couldn't get the box of paraffin because the power was out, and he was afraid that something might get him as he stood on the cellar stairs. Something that wasn't a common or a mass murderer, but a creature much worse than either. But it would simply slither part of its rotted itself up between the stairs, risers, and grab its ankle. That would go over big, wouldn't it? Others might laugh at such a fancy, but Bill wouldn't laugh. Bill would be mad. Bill would say, "Grow up, Georgie. Do you want this boat or not?" But if this fight were his cure, Bill called from his bedroom. "Did you die out there, Georgie?" "No, I'm getting it, Bill," George called back at once. He rubbed at his arm, trying to make the guilty goose flesh disappear and he smoothed skin again. I just stopped to get a drink. Well, hurry up. So he walked down the 4 steps to the cellar shelf. His heart a warm beating hammer in his throat, the hair on the nape of his neck standing at attention. His eyes hot, his hand cold, sure that at any moment the cellar door would swing shut on its own, closing off white light falling through the kitchen windows, and when it would hear it, something worse than all the commons and murders in the world, worse than the Japs, worse than Aladdin, the Hun, worse than the somethings, in 100 horror movies, it growling deeply. He would hear the growl in the looming seconds before it pounced him and unzipped his gut. The cellar smell was worse than ever today because of the flood. Their house was high on the Wickham Street, near the crest of the hill, and they had escaped the worst of it. But there was still standing water down there that had speed in through the old rock foundation. The smell was low and unpleasant, making you want to take only the shallowest breaths. George sniffed through the junk on the shelf as the first as he could old cans of kiwi shoe polish racks, a broken Curosens lamp, 2 mostly empty bottles of Windex, an old flat can turtle, seconds looking at the turtle on the lid with a kind of hypnotic wonder. Then he tossed it back, and here it was at last, a square box with the word Golf on it. George snatched it and ran up the stairs as fast as he could, suddenly aware that his shirt tail was out and suddenly sure that his shirt tail would be his undoing. The thing in the cellar would allow him to get almost all the way out, and then it would grab the tail of his shirt and snatched him backhand. He reached the kitchen and swept the door shut behind him. It banged gustily. He leaned back against it with his eyes closed. Sweat popped out on his arm and forehead. The box of powder gripped tightly in one hand. The piano had come to a stop, and his mom's voice floated to him. Georgie, can't you slam that door a little harder next time? Maybe you could break some of the plates in the Welch dresser if you really tried. Sorry, Mom, he called back. Georgie, you waste, Bill said from his bedroom. He pitched his voice low so their mother would not hear. George snickered a little. His fear was already gone. It had slipped away from him as easily as a nightmare slips away from a man who awakes cold skin and gassing from its grip, who feels his body and stares at his surroundings to make sure that one of it ever happened, and who then begins at once to forget it. Half is gone by the time his feet hit the floor, 3/4 of it by the time he emerged from the shower and begins the towel off, all of it by the time he finished his breakfast, all gone until the next time, when in the grip of the nightmare all fears will be remembered. That turtle, George thought, going to the counter drawer and where the matches were kept. Where did I see a turtle like that before? But no answer came, and he demised the question. He got a pack of matches from the drawer, a knife from the rack, holding the sharp edge studiously away from his body, as his dad had taught him, and a small bowl from the Welch dresser in the dining room. Then he went back into Bill's room. What in a hole you are, Georgie, Bill said, unmanly enough, and pushed back some of the sick stuff from his nightable. An empty glass, a pitcher of water, Kleenex, books, a bottle of Vicks, Vipo rub, the smell of which Bill would associate all his life with thick, personally chests and snotty noses. The old Philico radio was there, to play in not choppin' or bat, but a Little Richard tune, very softly, however, so softly that Little Richard was robbed of all his raw and elemental power. Their mother, who had studied classical piano at Jewel, hated rock and roll. She had not merely disliked it, she abominated it. I'm no a hole, George said, sitting on the edge of Bill's bed and putting the things he had gathered on the nightable. Yes, you are, Bill said. Nothing but a great big brown a hole, that's you. George tried to imagine a kid who was nothing but a great big a hole on legs, and began a giggle. You're a hole is bigger than Astogatus, Bill said, beginning to giggle too. Your a hole is bigger than a whole state, George replied. This broke both boys up for nearly 2 minutes. There followed a whisper conversation of the sort which means very little to anyone save small boys. Association of who was biggest a hole, who had the biggest a-hole, which a-hole was the brownest, and so on. Finally, Bill said one of the forbidden words. He accused George of being a big, brown, shitty a-hole, and they both got laughing hard. Bill's laughter turned into a coughing fit as it Nally began to taper off. By then, Bill's face had gone a plummet shade, which George regarded with some alarm. The piano stopped again. They both looked in the direction of the Palarin, listening for the piano bench, to scrape back, listening for their mother's imported footsteps. Bill buried his mouth in the crook of his elbow, stifling the last of the coughs, pointing at the pitcher. At the same time, George poured him a glass of water, which he drank off. The piano began once more, for else again. Stuttering Bill never forgot that piece, and even many years later it never failed to bring goose flesh to his arm and back. His heart would drop, and he would remember. My mother was playing that the day George died. You gonna cough any more, Bill? No. Bill pulled a Kleenex from the box, made a rumbling sound in his chest, spat plegement into the tissues, screwed it up, and tossed it into the water wastebasket by his bed, which was filled with similar twists of tissues. Then he opened the box of paraffin and dropped a waxy cube of the stuff into his palm. George watched him closely, but without speaking or questioning. Bill didn't like George talking to him while he did stuff, but George had learned that if he just kept his mouth shut, Bill would usually explain what he was doing. Bill used the knife to cut off a small piece of the paraffin cube. He put the piece in the bowl, then struck a match, and it put it on the top of the paraffin. The two boys watched the small yellow flame as the dying wind drove rain against the window and oscillated spatters. Got to waterproof the boat or it'll just get wet and sink, Bill said. When he was with George, he stuttered was light sometimes. He didn't stutter at all. In school, however, it could become so bad that talking became impossible for him. Communication would cease, and Bill's schoolmates would look somewhere else while Bill clutched the sides of his desk, his face growing almost as red as his hair, his eyes squeezed into slits as he tried to winch some word out of his stubborn throat. Sometimes, most times the word would come another time. It simply refused. He had been hit by a car when he was free and knocked into the side of the building. He had remained unconscious for 7 hours. Mom said it was the accident which had caused the stutterer. George sometimes got the feeling that his dad and Bill himself was not so sure. The piece of paraffin in the bowl was almost entirely melted. The match flame guttered lower, growing blue as it hugged the cardboard stick, and then it went out. Bill dipped his finger into the liquid, jerked it out with a faint hiss. He smiled appreciatively at George. Hot, he said after a few seconds. He dipped his finger in again and began to smear the wax along the sides of the boat, where it quickly dried to a milky haze. Can I do some? George asked. Okay, just don't get any on the blankets, or Mom will kill you. George dipped his finger into the paraffin, which was now very warm, but no longer hot, and began to spread it along the other side of the boat. Don't put on so much, you a-hole, Bill said. You want to sink it on its Madam curse? I'm sorry. That's all right. Just go easy. George finished the other side, then held the boat in his hand. It felt a little heavier, but not much. Too cold, he said. I'm going to go out and sail it. Yeah, you do that, Bill said. He suddenly looked tired and still not very well. I wish you could come, George said. He really did. Bill sometimes got bossy after a while, but he always had the coolest ideas, and he hardly ever hit. It's your boat, really. She, Bill said. You call boats she. She, then. I wish I could come too, Bill said glumly. Well, George shifted from one foot to the other, the boat in his hand. You put on your rain stuff, Bill said, or you'll wind up with the flu like me. Probably catch it anyway, from my germs. Thanks, Bill. It's a neat boat. And he did something he hadn't done for a long time. Something Bill never forget. He leaned over and kissed his brother's cheek. You'll catch it for sure now, you a-hole, Bill said, but he seemed cheered up. All the same, he smiled at George, put all his stuff back, too, or Mom have a bird. Sure, he gathered up the water-proven equipment and crossed, which was sitting as new in the little bowl. Georgie? George turned back to look at his brother. Be careful. Sure. His brow creased a little. That was something your mom said, not your big brother. It was as strange as him giving Bill a kiss. Sure, I will. He went out. Bill never saw him ever again. Free. Now here he was, chasing his boat down the left side of Witcham Street. He was running fast, but the water was running faster, and his boat was pulling ahead. He heard a deepening roar and saw that 50 yards farther down the hill, the water in the gutter was cascading into a storm drain that was still open. It was a long, dark, cylindrical cut until the curb, and as George watched, a stripped branch, its bark as dark and glistening as silicon shot into a storm drain's maw. It hung up there for a moment and then slipped down inside. That was where his boat was headed. Oh, shit! And Shalamo! He yelled, dismayed. He put on speed, and for a moment he thought he would catch the boat. Then one of his feet slipped, and he went sprawling, skinning one knee and crying out in pain. From his new pavement-level perspective, he watched his boat swing around twice momentarily, caught into another whirlpool, and then disappeared. Shit and Salamo! He yelled again, and slammed his fists down on the pavement. That hurt too, and began to cry a little. What a stupid way to lose the boat! He got up and walked over to the storm drain. He dropped to his knees and peered in. The water made a dank, hollow sound as it fell into the darkness. It was a spooky sound. It reminded him of, huh? The sound was jerked out of him as if on a string, and he recoiled. There were yellow eyes in there, the sort of eyes he had always imagined, but never actually seen down in the basement. It's an animal, he thought, and currently, that's all it was. Some animal, maybe a house cat that got stuck in there. Still, he was ready to run, would run in a second or two, when his mental switchboard had delayed with a stock those two shiny yellow eyes had given him. He felt the rough surface at the macadam under his finger and the thin sheet of cold water flowing around them. He saw himself getting up and backing away, and what was then when a voice, a perfectly reasonable and rather pleasant voice, spoke to him from inside the storm drain. "Hi, Georgie," it said. Georgie blinked and looked again. He could barely credit what he saw. It was like something from a made-up story or a movie where, the animals will talk and dance. If he had been 10 years older, he would not have believed what he was seeing. But he was not 16. He was 6. There was a clown in the storm drain. The light in there was far from good, but it was good enough so that George Depbrook was sure of what he was seeing. It was a clown, like in the circus or on TV. In fact, he looked like a cross between Bozo or Colorado, who talked by honking his, or was it her? George was never really sure of the gender. Horn on Howdy Doody Saturday mornings, Buffalo Bob was just about the only one who could understand Colorado. And that always cracked George up. The face of the clown in the storm drain was white. There were funny, tough reds of hair, or either side of his bald head, and there was a big clown smile painted over his mouth. If George had been inhabiting a later year, he would have surely thought of Ronald McDonald before Bozo or Colobone. The clown held a bunch of balloons of color, like Georgie ripe fruit in one hand. In other, he held George's newspaper boat. "Want your boat, Georgie?" The clown smiled. George smiled back. He couldn't help it. It was kind of smile. You just had to answer. "I sure do," he said. The clown laughed. "I sure do. That's good. That's very good. And how about a balloon?" Well, sure. He reached forward and then drew his hand resolutely back. "I'm not supposed to take stuff from strangers. My dad said so." "Very wise of your dad," the clown in the storm drain said, smiling. How George wondered. Could I have thought his eyes were yellow? There were brighter dancing blue, the color of his mom's eyes, and Bill's. Very wise indeed. Therefore, I would introduce myself. I, Georgie, am Mr. Bob Gray, also known as Pennywise, the dancing clown. Pennywise, meet George Depbrook. George, meet Pennywise. And now we know each other. I'm not a stranger to you, and you're not a stranger to me. Keyrick. Georgie giggled. I guess so. He reached forward again and drew hand back again. How did you get here? There. Storm just blew me away, Pennywise the dancing clown said. It blew the whole circus away. Can you smell the circus, Georgie? Georgie leaned forward. Suddenly he could smell peanuts. Hot roasted peanuts. And vinegar. The white kind you put on your French fries through a hole in a cap. He could smell cotton candy and frying doughboys and the faint but thunderous odor of wild animal shit. He could smell the cheery aroma of midwife sawdust, and yet under it all, the smell of flood and discomposing leaves, and dark storm drain all shadows. That smell was wet and rotten, the cellar smell, but the other smell was stronger. You bet I can smell it, he said. Want your boat, Georgie? Pennywise asked. I only repeat myself because you really do not seem eager. He held it up, smiling. He was wearing a baggy silk suit with great big orange buttons, a bright tie, electric blue, flopped down his front, and on his hand were big white gloves, like the kind Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck always wore. Yes, sure, Georgie said, looking into the sandstorm. And a balloon? I've got red and green and yellow and blue. Do they float? Float. The clown grins widened. Oh, yes, indeed they do. They float. And there's cotton candy. George reached. The clown seized his arm, and George saw the clown's face change. What he saw then was terrible enough to make his dwarf imagines of the thing in the cellar look like sweet dreams. What he saw destroyed his sanity in one of Claw's strokes. They float. The thing in the drain crooned in the cluckling voice. He held Georgie's arm in its thick and warmy grip. It pulled George toward that terrible darkness where the water rushed and roared and bellowed as it bore its cargo of storm debris toward the sea. George craned his neck away from the final blackness and began to scream into the rain, to scream mindlessly into the white autumn sky which curved above Derry on that day in the fall of 1957. His screams were shrill and piercing, and all up and down Witcham Street people came to their windows or bolted out of their porches. They float, it growled. They float, Georgie. And when you're down here with me, you'll float too! George's shoulder sucked against the cement of the curb, and Dave Gardner, who had stayed home from his job, the shore boat, that day because of the flood, saw only a small boy in a yellow rain slicker, a small boy who was screaming and written in the gutter with muddy water surface over his face and making his screams sound bubbly. Everything down here floats, that chuckling, rotten voice whispered, and suddenly there was a ripping voice in a flaring street of agony, and George Stepbrook knew no more. Dave Jutterin was the first to get there, and although he arrived only 45 seconds after the first scream, George Stepbrook was already dead. Gardner grabbed him by the back of the slicker, pulled him into the street, and began to scream as himself as George's body turned over his hands. The left side of Georgie's slicker was now bright red. Blood flowed into the storm drain from the tattering hole where the left arm had been. A knob of bone, horribly bright, peeked through the torn cloth. The boy's eyes stared up into the white sky, and as Dave strutted away toward the others, already running pell-mell down the street, they began to fill up with rain. Far, somewhere below, in the storm drain that already filled nearly to capping with runoff, there could be no one down there. The county sheriff was later examined to a Derry News reporter with a frustrated fury so great it was almost agony. Hirkos himself would have been swept away in a driving current. George's newspaper boat shot onward through nighted chambers and long concerned hallways that roared and chimed with water. For a while it ran neck and neck with a dead chicken and floated when its yellowed reptiled toes pointed at the drip ceiling. Then, at some junction east of town, the chicken was swept off to the left while George's boat went straight. An hour later, while George's mother was being cemented in the emergency room at Derry Home Hospital, and while stuttering Bill sat stunned and white and silent in his bed, listening to his father sob huskily in the parlor where his mother had been playing for else when George went out. The boat shout out through a concert loophole like a bullet, exciting the muzzle of a gun, and ran at speed down a Soloway and into an unnamed stream. when it joined the boiling, swollen Persicot River 20 minutes later, the first riff of blue had begun to show in sky. Overhead, the storm was over the boat, decked and swayed and sometimes took on water, but it did not sink. The two-boater had waterproofed it well. I do not know where it finally fetched up. If ever it did, perhaps it reached the sea and sails there forever, like a magic boat in a fairy tale. All I know is that it was still afloat and still running on the breast of the flood when it passed the Intercrumbs town limits of Derry, Maine. And there it passes out of this tale forever. Wow, wow, wow.